A hush descended upon Harper's, Chicago's most elite dining haven, so dense it felt like a physical force pressing down on the room. Conversations died, forks and knives hung suspended, and every gaze locked onto the narrow gap between the tables. 12-year-old Ethan Alex stood trembling, his legs, bound by unyielding metal braces, quivered as he extended a hesitant hand toward Naomi John, the restaurant's sole black waitress. The delicate notes of a live piano had just begun to weave a gentle melody through the air, sparking Ethan's sudden, unbidden urge to invite her to dance. "Sir, rein in your son," Manager Walter's voice sliced through the stillness, sharp and commanding that's inappropriate. "This is not a dance hall, and our employees are not here to entertain children." George Alex, owner of Alex Investments and one of the richest men in the country, swallowed hard. It was the first time he had taken Ethan out to dinner in public since the accident that had partially paralyzed his legs 2 years earlier, a mistake he would not repeat. "Ethan, sit down." The order came low but firm. Naomi remained motionless, her gaze shifting between the manager, the billionaire, and the boy whose hand was still hanging in the air. In her 5 years working there, she had learned to become invisible, especially to customers like Alex. "Mr. Walter, I'm leaving. My shift is over." Her voice sounded calm as she removed her apron and placed it on the tray. Then, to everyone's amazement, she smiled at Ethan and took his hand. "I can't dance in an apron." George stood up abruptly. "What do you think you're doing?" Naomi held his gaze. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." Before anyone could interfere, Ethan took a hesitant step forward, his foot dragged painfully across the floor, and the metal of his braces screeched. But Naomi didn't try to guide him or hurry him, she simply adjusted her own pace to his. "She's getting fired tomorrow," whispered a woman at the next table. George watched, paralyzed. A sudden memory struck him, Alice, his late wife, dancing with Ethan in the living room. "It's not about perfection," she had said, "it's about connection." As Naomi followed Ethan's clumsy steps, something in the boy's eyes changed. Fear gave way to intense concentration, shame gave way to shy pride. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't being guided, helped, or corrected, he was leading. "Mr. Alex," the manager's voice interrupted his thoughts, "I can assure you this will never happen again. She will be properly disciplined." George didn't respond. The entire restaurant seemed to wait for his reaction. After all, a man of his power could end anyone's career with a single word. Employees stopped what they were doing, other customers watched with morbid curiosity. Ethan's smile, however, was the only sound that echoed in his mind. Naomi led the boy back to the table after 3 dance steps. "Thank you for asking me out," she said formally, as if speaking to an adult. "It was an honor." When she turned to leave, George stopped her. "Wait." His voice sounded different, almost unrecognizable to himself. "What's your full name?" "Naomi John, sir." George nodded slowly. "Naomi John," he repeated as if memorizing it. Then he took a card from inside his jacket and held it out to her. "My office, tomorrow at 10 a.m. The entire restaurant held its breath. Naomi accepted the card without showing any emotion, but her hand trembled slightly. "Dad," Ethan called as she walked away, "why did you do that?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. George watched his son, and for a brief moment saw not just the child Alice had left in his care, but a complete human being whose wants and needs he had systematically ignored for 2 years. As dinner proceeded in awkward silence, no one noticed Naomi's glance before she left, not out of fear or resignation, but out of a calm determination that contrasted with the storm brewing in George Alex's eyes. On May 7, 2024, the lobby of Alex Towers sparkled with its glass and marble walls, reflecting the morning sunlight. Naomi John immediately felt out of place in her best outfit, a navy blue skirt and white blouse bought on sale. The people passing by her wore clothes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "Naomi John to see Mr. Alex," she said to the receptionist, who examined her with a clinical gaze before making a call. 18th floor. "Mr. James will see you." In the elevator, Naomi took a deep breath, clutching her worn purse to her chest. It wasn't fear she felt, it was a quiet determination that came from having faced worse, much worse. Mr. James was a man in his 40s with a sharp gaze and impeccable posture. Mr. Alex is in a conference call. Please follow me. As she walked through the mirrored hallways, Naomi felt the curious stares of the employees. A black woman being escorted through the executive offices was a rare enough occurrence to cause speculation. He had you fired, didn't he? James asked suddenly when they were alone in a waiting room. It happens. Powerful clients call, and people like you lose their jobs. People like me? You know what I mean. James adjusted his glasses. Employees who don't know their place. Naomi smiled, not amused. And where exactly would that be? Before James could answer, his phone rang. He'll see you now. George Alex's office took up half the floor. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago looked like a distant playground. The man stood, gazing out at the city as if it were his personal property. Mr. Alex, Naomi greeted him formally. George turned, his face a mask of studied control. Miss Naomi, thank you for coming. He pointed to a chair. Please. The silence that followed was calculated, a tactic Naomi recognized immediately. It was the kind of silence designed to make nervous people talk too much, incriminate themselves. Do you have a background? George finally asked. Excuse me? Education. College. Naomi kept her gaze steady. Bachelor's degree in child development from Northwestern. Incomplete master's degree in special education. Something flashed across George's face. Surprise, perhaps. And you work as a waitress? I work 3 jobs actually. The restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, and as a tutor when I can get students. George moved to her table, picking up a folder. I did some research on you, Miss John. I wanted to understand who the person was who, he hesitated, danced with my son. He opened the folder, revealing printed photos of a community center. Freedom Steps. You founded that 5 years ago. Naomi sat up straighter in her chair. I co-founded it with my sister, Ruth. A dance program for children with physical disabilities. George leafed through some documents, which is now about to close due to lack of funding. Naomi showed no surprise. Of course he would find all that out in less than 24 hours. I didn't come here to ask you for money, Mr. Alex. Then why did you come? Because you invited me. George laughed softly, a joyless sound. Fair enough. He stood up again, restless. I want you to work for me. Naomi blinked, genuinely taken aback. As a waitress in your house? George's face hardened. As a therapeutic companion for Ethan. His son's name seemed difficult for him to say. Naomi noticed how his eyes momentarily drifted to a photo on the table. A smiling woman holding a baby. I have the best specialists in the country, George continued. Physical therapists, neurologists, psychologists. But what you did yesterday, he paused as if the words betrayed him. It was just a dance, Mr. Alex. It was the first time I've seen him smile since the accident. The admission was painful. I don't want a dancer for my son. I want someone who can do what you did. Follow, not lead. Naomi studied the man in front of her. Beneath the facade of power and control, she saw what others might not. A desperate, lost father. I can pay you 4 times what you're making now. Naomi stood up. No, George looked shocked, like someone unaccustomed to hearing that word. I don't work for people who see only my color or my social class before they see my competence, she explained calmly. And I definitely don't work for people who try to buy solutions to emotional problems. George's face flushed. You're turning down an offer that would solve your financial problems out of pride? Out of dignity, Naomi corrected, and because your son deserves more than someone hired to pretend to care. She walked to the door, then paused. Ethan doesn't need more experts. He needs space to lead his own life. You don't know my son. No, Naomi agreed, but I know people like him. People whose physical limitations are nothing compared to the invisible cages we build around them. She took a card from her purse and placed it on the table. Freedom Steps. Classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 p.m. If you'd like to bring Ethan, the first class is free. As Naomi left, she passed James, who had obviously been listening behind the door. "You just turned down an offer from George Alex?" he whispered incredulously. "Are you crazy?" Naomi smiled. "Maybe. But I'd rather be crazy than be property." On May 14, 2024, Naomi was at the reception desk of the community center when Ruth, her sister and co-founder of the project, came running up. "There's a Ferrari parked outside," she whispered nervously, adjusting her hijab, "and you won't believe who's inside." Through the window, Naomi saw the luxurious car. Ethan was in the back seat, looking anxiously out the window. George remained in the driver's seat, his hands still on the steering wheel, as if fighting an internal battle. "He's not coming in," Ruth predicted. "Men like him don't come to places like this." Naomi smiled, remembering Ethan's gaze during those brief moments of dancing. Don't underestimate the power of a determined son. As they watched, the car door opened. Ethan got out slowly, adjusting his gadgets. Then, to everyone's surprise, George got out too. The billionaire looked out of place in his casual pants and sweater, an obvious attempt to dress less formally but still screaming privilege. "I told you he'd come," Naomi murmured, more to herself. Ruth stared at her. "What did you do?" Naomi didn't answer, but her eyes sparkled with a secret that not even her sister fully knew. In her tiny apartment in Chicago's South Side, hidden under her bed, was a notebook filled with notes about children like Ethan and men like George Alex, years of observation, research, and a plan that had begun with a simple acceptance of an invitation to dance. What George Alex didn't know, what he couldn't imagine in his world of glass towers and endless bank accounts, was that Naomi John wasn't just a waitress who had agreed to dance with his son. She was a woman with a mission, and his empire of isolation and privilege was about to face its greatest challenge, the simple truth that some of the greatest lessons in life cannot be bought, they must be lived. Freedom Steps operated out of an old community warehouse. Handmade posters decorated the walls with phrases like, "Your rhythm, your rules, and every move counts." When George and Ethan entered, children with various types of mobility devices practiced free movements to the sound of a light beat. "Mr. Alex," Naomi approached, wearing simple clothes with the program logo, "Welcome." Ethan watched the children in awe. A girl in a wheelchair spun in precise circles, while a boy with a prosthetic leg created a sequence of steps. "It looks chaotic," George commented, visibly uncomfortable. "There is structure," Naomi replied. "It's just not the one you recognize." She turned to Ethan. "Would you like to join in?" The boy nodded enthusiastically but looked at his father, hesitant. "Go on," George said tensely. "I'll be right here." As Naomi guided Ethan to the group, Ruth approached George and offered him a chair. "The first day is always the hardest," she commented, "for the parents, not the kids." "This isn't therapy," George argued. "I hired the best rehabilitation specialists." "And how has that been working for Ethan?" Ruth asked gently. The studio door opened. An older man entered, leaning on an ornate cane. He had gray hair and a commanding presence. "Dr. Bill Mark," Ruth whispered, "neuroscientist specializing in brain plasticity. Retired from Chicago." The man greeted several children before noticing George. "Mr. Alex, you've rejected my research proposal 3 times in the last 2 years. Dr. Mark, I didn't expect to see you here." "I oversee the research program," he explained. "We're studying how non-directive approaches to movement affect neural reconfiguration in children with motor challenges." "Research?" George frowned. "I thought this was just a community dance class." Naomi returned, leaving Ethan exploring movements with another child. Freedom Steps is a pilot motor rehabilitation program based on the theory of movement autonomy, she explained. "We integrate adaptive dance with neuroscientific principles." "Why do you work as a waitress if you lead a research program?" "Because we don't have adequate funding yet, and because people like you rejected us 3 times. The penny dropped. You were Dr. Mark's assistant on the proposals." "Co-author," Dr. Mark corrected. "Naomi has an incomplete master's degree because she had to leave college to take care of her sister, but her theoretical work is groundbreaking." "You knew who I was at the restaurant," George concluded. "From the moment you walked in," Naomi confirmed. And when Ethan got up to dance, I recognized the opportunity to show, not tell. Was it staged, the dance? Absolutely not. Ethan chose to get up. I chose to follow. On May 14, 2024, a group of reporters entered the studio. George immediately tensed. What's this? Part 2 of the plan. Naomi smiled slightly. Ruth showed George a newly published article. Revolutionary motor rehabilitation methodology shows promising results. We published our first results today, Dr. Mark explained, and we invited the press. You used my son for a public relations stunt. George's voice was pure ice. Naomi led him into a side room where photos of dozens of children adorned the walls, each with handwritten progress statistics. On the last wall was an empty frame. What's that? He asked. Our future. The full rehabilitation center we could build if we had the resources. 400 children a year instead of 60. You orchestrated all this, George muttered. The dance, the meeting, bringing me here on press day. I saw an opportunity and took it. 5 months ago, when you canceled our meeting without reading the proposal, I promised myself I'd find a way. Ruth interrupted. It's Ethan. They rushed back. Ethan was in the center of the room, surrounded by other children. Someone had turned off the music, and everyone watched in silence. The boy had removed one of his braces and was trying to balance on just one support. Ethan, George started forward, but Naomi stopped him. Wait, she whispered. Watch. Ethan took a deep breath, focused, then, to everyone's amazement, especially his father's, he took a complete step without full support. It was small, shaky, but entirely his. The children cheered, camera flashes went off. George's face, usually composed and unreadable, was now exposed, with unshed tears glistening in his eyes. That's why we created Freedom Steps, Naomi said softly. It's not about perfect steps, it's about first steps on your own. George watched his son, not as a problem to be managed, but as a complete person discovering his own strength. This could have been done without manipulating me, he said finally. It could have been if you had answered our calls or read our proposals 3 times. The reporters noticed George. A murmur grew as Ethan, oblivious to the tension, continued practicing his new step with an expression of pure concentration. George Alex was cornered. Before him lay 2 options: withdraw in anger, confirming to the press his reputation as cold and calculating, or embrace the moment his son had created. Between the power he had always wielded and the freedom his son needed, George found himself in unfamiliar territory, one where neither his money nor his influence defined the next step. The man who controlled every aspect of his life now faced a choice that no amount of wealth could buy. His gaze shifted between his smiling son and the reporters waiting for his reaction. Humility was not a virtue in his vocabulary, but as he saw the transformation on Ethan's face, something inside him began to break. The orchestra of power and privilege he was accustomed to now play a different tune, and he had to decide. Would he continue conducting, or would he learn to follow? On May 15, 2024, George Alex faced the reporters waiting for his reaction. His son had just taken a step on his own in front of the cameras, and Naomi John had skillfully led him to this impossible moment. Mr. Alex, a reporter approached, could you comment on your presence at Freedom Steps today? Is it true that your foundation rejected funding this program 3 times? George glanced at Ethan, who was still practicing his new step, oblivious to the political tension. Then, to everyone's surprise, especially Naomi's, he smiled. You know what's hardest for someone in my position? George addressed the reporter but spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Admitting when we're wrong. A stunned silence filled the room. The Alex Foundation is pleased to announce a commitment to fully fund Freedom Steps for the next 4 years and to build a permanent rehabilitation center based on the methodology developed by Dr. Mark and Ms. John. Camera flashes exploded. Ruth let out a cry of surprise. On one condition, he added, watching Naomi tense up, that Ms. John retain complete autonomy over the program and its methodology. No corporate interference. On August 12, 2024, bulldozers were clearing the ground for the new Free Steps Rehabilitation Medical Center. The project wasn't the most luxurious the Alex Foundation had ever funded, but it was the most innovative, with every space designed with direct input from the children and their families. Naomi supervised the construction frequently, but never alone. Ethan showed up regularly, sometimes bringing other children with him, and, to the staff's continued surprise, George Alex also showed up, silently observing the progress. "I never thought you'd actually show up at board meetings," Naomi commented one afternoon as they reviewed the plans. "I never thought I'd have to study neuroplasticity at 50, George replied, rubbing his tired eyes. In front of him was a scientific article marked with post-it notes. "But here we are." Naomi looked at the man curiously. "Is this part of your public penance, or do you really care?" Ethan asked to have his second brace removed last week. "I know, he told me." His previous physical therapist said that would be impossible for at least 18 months. Naomi smiled. "But you fired her, remember? Because you told me she was wrong." "And she was." Naomi pointed to a photo of Ethan balancing with only one crutch. "He's progressing faster than any traditional medical prediction." "Why did you never accept my apology?" George asked suddenly. "Because you never apologized. You redirected resources, changed policies, funded our program. That's not an apology, it's compensation." George nodded slowly. "Fair again." On November 19, 2024, at the opening ceremony, the contrast with that night in the restaurant couldn't have been greater. The huge adaptive space was filled with children with various types of mobility devices, all moving freely. In the center of the main hall, Ethan, now wearing only a lightweight brace on his left leg, led a small choreographed routine with 3 other children. His movements were still limited, but they flowed with a confidence no doctor had predicted. George watched from a distance, not interfering. "He doesn't need you to hold him anymore," Naomi said, approaching quietly. "No," George agreed, "but he still needs me to be around." Crucial difference. George turned to face her. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what exactly?" "For teaching me to follow." A reporter approached. "Mr. Alex, how does it feel to see your son's progress?" George looked at Ethan, who was now helping a younger girl find her balance. "Proud. Not of what he's overcome, but of what he's created for others." "And what's been the biggest lesson you've learned on this journey?" George Alex, the man who had once been known only for his financial empire, looked directly into the camera. That true leaders aren't those who guide others down the path they believe is right, but those who have the courage to follow when someone shows them a better way. On November 3, 2024, the Freedom Steps program expanded to 4 new cities. Naomi received the Pediatric Rehabilitation Innovation Award, and her methodology began to be implemented in hospitals across the country. Ethan, now using only a light cane on difficult days, enrolled in regular school and became a youth spokesperson for the program, inspiring other children to find their own pace. And George learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of all. True power isn't found in orchestrating every step, but in the wisdom to step aside and let others chart the path forward. In a world where the mighty seldom shift their views and the voiceless linger in obscurity, the tale of George, Naomi, and Ethan unveils a profound truth. Transformation ignites when we breach the unseen walls dividing us, when a billionaire heeds the wisdom of a waitress, when a father trails the brave footsteps of his son.